While we lived in Dallas, Vandy and I bought a house in haste. Before that, we were living in a condo-style apartment. It was a 5-minute walk to our parish, the Chapel of the Cross. 5 minutes from the school where I worked, the St. Timothy School, which was also where my children attended school. It was a very safe neighborhood, directly across the street of one of the best parks in the city, and right next to another cathedral-style church that frequently offered free concerts. This 2-bedroom condo, we paid $900 per month in Uptown Dallas, and that included utilities. But I wanted a house, so I bought one. I spent everything I had, and then I spent the next 2 years spending over $12,000 in DIY projects just to make that house that I wanted so badly not really, really, really gross. It was really gross, but it was mine. Actually, it was the bank's, but I got to live there. In that 2 years, spending money that I did not have, I completed 5 DIY projects. How many were there? A new shower, new cabinetry, a new wood floor, new baseboards and beadboard, and a new backsplash. Long story short, we lived in this house. It wasn't very gross after I got done with it. But then we had a fire. For those of you that know me, that's not a surprise. But we had the opportunity to invest the insurance money in the house to make some big renovations. Now, at this point, we knew that we were going to move to Georgia. And so we were walking through the house with our realtor, and she was naming some things that she would suggest that we use the money to redo or improve. She was absolutely, well, she didn't know what she was saying, but she said it was an absolute necessity to rip out 5 items. She said, "I don't know when that wood floor was installed, but woof. And that backsplash, yikes. The carpenter that installed that beadboard and baseboard must have had vertigo, because it's gots to go." It was a very humbling experience, and I did not tell her that I had done the work. But it did make me reflect that I had traded the most pleasant home, that 2-bedroom condo, a 5-minute walk from my parish, work, and school, the most pleasant home we ever lived in, centered around my parish, because I wanted to build a crappy little shack. Our subject today is building our lives upon Christ, the cornerstone, and not on building crappy little shacks. Our subject is not to be anxious, not to be hasty, not to give in to our fears over how our life might not pan out, but to put our trust in God, who is building his church on the rock. Humans often choose to build refuges built on sand. They will not stand the coming destruction. This is a needed message for us because, as I'll explain, the world as we know it is going to change. We are like Israel, nervous and anxious because Babylon and Assyria are swirling up north, and this pot will spill over and drown us. We, the church, can smell the salty breeze from the tsunami that is heading our way. And we'll have a choice to make. Will we hide in the shelters that we make for ourselves, or will we build our lives around the cornerstone, on the cornerstone? Our text this morning is Isaiah 28. If you're new here, we're taking 2.5 months to walk through the book of Isaiah. And we're going to explain each chapter that we preach on in the fourfold sense of Scripture. And just in case the newcomers don't know what it is, church, what is the fourfold sense of Scripture? Literal, typological. Very good. So let us start with the literal sense. Are you ready? Great. I'm glad to hear it. I'm ready too, so let's go. All right, so Isaiah 28. The context here is that Yahweh is condemning the ruling class of Israel. He references them in the first verse of our passage on page 10, I believe. He says, those who rule in Jerusalem. And he's condemning them because they have made a strategic alliance with Egypt. You see, Assyria and Babylon are facing off against each other in the north. And that boiling pot will soon tip over and come south. Well, who's south? Israel. And then who's further south? Egypt. And so they think, we're in a similar predicament with the Egyptians down there. We'll see if they want to form an alliance. If they come south, we'll join forces. So they thought. Never mind that this was the very sort of thing that Yahweh said that they should not do. Do not make alliances with your neighbors. He prohibited them from this. Why? Because Yahweh was going to fight for his people. He was to be their refuge, their house. But Israel couldn't wait for that refuge to be built. They acted in haste and they built their own refuge. Within that background, let's take a look at the text. Go ahead in your bulletins, turn to page 10. Verse 15. You rulers in Jerusalem have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol have we made an agreement. When the overwhelming whip passes through, it will not come to us. For we have made lies our refuge, and in falsehood have we taken shelter. So this alliance with Egypt, they're ironically taking great comfort in, saying that nothing's going to affect us. We've got not Yahweh at our back, but the very nation that God had delivered them from. They're claiming that as their refuge. Sound familiar from the wilderness wanderings? Where were they always trying to hearken back to? Egypt. They still have that ancient disease that refuses to trust God to protect them, even after all he's done. So this alliance is a hasty house. It's a refuge that will be destroyed. God calls it a covenant with death, an agreement with Sheol, which was the place of the dead. So it's within this context of a hasty house that Isaiah utters the famous passage about the cornerstone. He says, thus saith the Lord, behold, I am the one who has laid as a foundation in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. Whoever believes in that stone will not act in haste. What was their action in haste? An alliance with whom? Egypt. Whoever believes in the stone that I lay, in the refuge that I build, will not act in haste. To the original hearers, this is saying that God is building a refuge, not a hasty shelter, but a stone fortress. If only they would rely on him and not grasp for their own security and power. The house that God builds will be what he always intended. In verse 17, he says, I'm going to make justice the line. That's the line that shoots down the side of a building. He's going to build it straight. Straight as justice. And righteousness is the plumb line. That's the vertical line for the walls. This temple refuge that Yahweh is building will be the only refuge for the people. It will be a sign of the covenant that they have not with death, but with the life giver. Their silly, shabby, false refuge will be destroyed, as will their covenant with death. But sadly, this generation will be destroyed along with their hasty house, their alliance with Egypt. Verse 18, when the overwhelming scourge passes through, you will be beaten down by it. As often as it passes through, it will take you. From morning by morning, it will pass through. By day and by night, and it will be sheer terror to understand the message. So the Israelites will discover that the quick shacks that we build for ourselves never protect against what we fear. And furthermore, they will never satisfy in the meantime. Verse 20, go ahead and look at it. It's one of my favorite verses about sin. It says, for the bed is too short to stretch oneself on, and the covering or the blanket is too narrow to wrap oneself in. Isn't that such a great picture of sin? Not only will God wipe away these houses we build for ourselves, but to go back to the example, the houses that we build for ourselves stink. The beds are uncomfortable that we build for ourselves. The blankets leave us cold. They're too narrow. The beds are too short. Before we move into the typological, I want you to have this image clearly. You have this nation of Israel, who by the mighty hand of Yahweh had dominated two world powers, Egypt and Canaan. They had seen the promises of conquest come about very recently with David and Solomon. They had every reason to trust Yahweh, that he would protect them. But instead, they built a crappy little shack with the materials that they had on hand. And in this crappy little shack, they are lying in their bed like a little pig with a house made of straw. But this bed, because it was built in haste, isn't even big enough for them. The blanket, woven in haste, isn't wide enough to wrap them up. So not only is their crappy little shack not going to protect them from the big bad wolf, it isn't even a good house. It doesn't satisfy. Let's move on to the typological. As usual, we just have to look to Paul and Jesus for the typological. Jesus is the cornerstone of this sure refuge that God is building. Paul says in Ephesians 2 that Jesus is the precious cornerstone. He's referring to this passage in Isaiah 28. And that the apostles and the prophets are the sure foundation. Because the text in 28 says, I'm laying a precious cornerstone and a sure foundation. So what is the cornerstone? Jesus. And a tougher one, what's the foundation? That's right, the apostles and the prophets. This prophetic word is picked up in Psalm 118. This cornerstone will be rejected. And yet those who believe will not be in haste. God will raise up this cornerstone, and he will be the start of a new temple, a sure refuge, an impenetrable fortress, and the covenant of death will be annulled. What the Israelites didn't understand is that this prophecy about Jesus being the cornerstone is a counter-temple prophecy. The later prophets would equate this refuge of lies, this crappy little shack, with the temple itself. The people were trusting in the temple and not the God of the temple, so God would destroy it and them. Thus, the promise to build a new temple with Christ as the chief cornerstone is a judgment on any other refuge upon which we might trust. I had never noticed the cornerstone passage in that context before. It's a condemnation on anything we could hope for except for God. So if this cornerstone is Jesus and this new temple is the church, what typologically are these crappy little shacks that we build for ourselves? What covenants in death have we made? And for that, let's turn to the moral sense. It's Advent 1, so you have to be tough, right? Advent is a penitential season. Are you ready for a penitential word? Oh, good. That's great. I have one to give. Each generation has a different crappy little shack that they build. One thing that has changed so drastically in the last 30 years is the habit of hoarding. The closer a generation was to the Great Depression, the more likely they are to be a pack rat. There is no doubt some virtue in this. I'm certainly not condoning the flippant, wasteful, I'll just buy a new one thing that's replaced it. But the impulse in the older generations to store up possessions and money against the future can be a crappy little shack. In a nasty dose of irony, so many Americans have stored up their wealth so effectively that they can afford to live in self-contained communities that no young person would ever have to visit them. It's sad. But materialism is not limited to the older hoarders. Anxiety is at an all-time high. There are more people, percentage-wise, that are on anxiety medication than ever before. Every anxious heartbeat that pounds in our chest as we lie in bed worrying about money is the sound of a hammer building a crappy little shack. As if our refuge was in our wealth. I have a word for you. Hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and waters will overwhelm the shelter. We are not heading into a century of prosperity, Christ the King. 2008 was just a precursor. It came about because greedy bankers and greedy home buyers couldn't help themselves. But have we changed? Are we more virtuous than we were back then? Have we gained virtue by controlling our spending? We are just as wanton as we ever were, and far worse in our sexual perversion. God will judge us, and we will deserve it. All the financials advisors are running around trying to carve out a little bit of margin, but those who are wise can already see the writing on the wall. All those who trust in God are not worried, for what is money? Blessed are the poor. Does God not provide? Thus, there is a great recentering happening. I see a return to the cornerstone. People are starting to wake up. They know that the refuges that have been built in the last 75 years will not stand. The institutions will not stand. The planned neighborhoods will not stand. The political structure will not stand. The political solutions will not stand. The 401ks and Social Security will not stand. American dominance will not stand. The career pathways will not stand. The universities, they already aren't standing. They won't stand. The school system, it will not stand. The norm of constant entertainment will not stand. The wealth of medical care will not stand. The safety of our streets will not stand. This one's a tough one. The church's tax status will not stand. Freedom of worship will not stand. We've already seen that during COVID. Protections for the young will not stand. Protections for the unborn will not stand. So why, church, do we make our covenant with death? Why does the church ally herself to Egypt? There is only one refuge that will never fall, and that is the church. All the crappy little shacks built on the sand will topple over, but God has laid a foundation in Zion, Jesus Christ the stone, the precious cornerstone, and a sure foundation on the apostles and prophets. Thus, the great recentering that is taking place is forming around this God-built refuge. In the next several decades, the neighborhoods that will flourish will not be near a Walmart, they will be near a parish. Families that flourish will stay not near the 4 quad softball fields, but near their parish, where they are known, where their kids are known, where their grandchildren are known. Parishes that flourish will be places of care, not just for the young, but for the old. They will form microeconomies where careers are coupled with community. They will educate their children. They will plant schools. Canton, at some point, you should plant a school. We already have a school here, so. The parishes that will flourish will saturate neighborhoods. They will create permeable, missional havens where children can play. Parishes that thrive will have learned to tithe faithfully right now while there's plenty, because it won't get any easier to tithe in the future. Parishes that stand will not care about their tax status. Their parishioners will not care about their 401ks. These are crappy little shacks. They will fall, and God's church will stand. Not even the gates of hell can withstand King Jesus. Parishes that stand will never back away from the priority of worship, the centrality of the Eucharist. For us, it will always be essential. Anything that gets in the way of it is a covenant with Sheol. Not only will it not stand in the judgment that is coming, but it won't even satisfy in the meantime. It's a short bed and a narrow blanket. This week, as we begin our Advent season, ask yourself what crappy little shack you've built for yourself. Take time to notice how uncomfortable the beds are, how cold the blankets are. Have you built yourself a shelter of lust because you're afraid your life will go by without pleasure? Have you built a shelter of wrath because you're afraid that God will not judge the wicked by himself? Have you built a shelter of gluttony because you're afraid that his bread really won't satisfy you? Have you built a shelter of pride because you're afraid that his validation will not suffice? So you see that we can build shelters with these broad external patterns of how we live, but we can also build crappy little shelters internally when we're in private. These actions, too, reveal where we place our hope. To these fears, let me remind you of our Advent hope for our anagogical sense. Jesus is coming soon. Maranatha. Say Maranatha. Say Maranatha. He will destroy every shelter. The only thing that remains will be that which is built on the foundation of that rock, which is Christ. In that house, the wood floors will never need to be ripped out and replaced. The beadboard is great. You're going to love it.